Commission. To begin this evening, I would like to reiterate that I'm presiding from the city of Yakima, which is on the ceded territory of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakima Nation, the first peoples of this land. To introduce the topics for discussion and action on our agenda this evening, I want to first reiterate our mandate. The mandate of the Commission set out in the Washington State Redistricting Act is to accomplish state legislative and congressional redistricting in accordance with the Washington State Constitution. The bipartisan commission was created to listen to the public every 10 years so that districts would be drawn by statute and with public input. I'm going to begin by talking just a moment about the composition of the commission. Each commissioner was appointed to this commission. The 4 voting commissioners were appointed by the Democratic caucus in the House, the Republican caucus in the House, the Republican caucus in the Senate, or the Democratic caucus in the Senate. I was appointed by the 4 voting commissioners. As chair of the commission, I will articulate and manage the commission's process. In my role as chair, I will ensure the process is as participatory, fair, and equitable as is possible. The 4 voting commissioners have power and responsibility to vote, ultimately creating and adopting a redistricting plan. Voting commissioners will make decisions that will create maps to best represent the interest of all Washingtonians. A note to the public. Those of you from the public who are joining us today, welcome. It is my goal to encourage communities across Washington as fully as I can and to hear and address your concerns and requests. Throughout our tenure as commissioners, we will hear public comments that are important, ideas, requests, and injustices that may fall outside our ability to effectively respond. There are issues you may bring forward in your public comments that we may not be able to address. We can listen to you and be sure to capture your thoughts, questions, and requests. I will do my best to synthesize these and will respond to them as we are able. We will certainly deliberate on the issues where we do have jurisdiction. Where we don't, I will do my best to refer you to those who may be able to respond more effectively. I also want to take this opportunity to reiterate our purpose and values. Together as a commission, we've agreed to the following values and mission: to provide an open, transparent, credible process that is grounded in statute and where all voices are welcome and there is access for everyone. To conduct ourselves with transparency, respect, and civility, where commissioners will participate and negotiate in good faith, and to meet the deadline outlined by law and to produce the best possible maps. It is my intention to reiterate what I have heard from the public between meetings. Since our meeting on May 10th, this is what I have heard. The Redistricting Commission received questions from the Wenatchee School District and the Benton Public Utility District about when to expect the redistricting data. Commission staff replied to these queries. A member of the public pointed out that links to the 2011 maps are broken on our website. We appreciate being notified of this problem. We are in the process of launching the new website and will ensure that links to the old maps are restored with the launch of our new website. A resident of Friday Harbor wrote in to recommend that the commission spend money for software to enable citizens to participate in the map drawing process. In the last cycle, he had used Dave's Redistricting, which was difficult to learn and cumbersome when submitting to the commission. He endorsed the idea of investing in a good mapping tool that would ensure that a large swath of voters are able to participate in the process and contribute to a better plan. A member of the public asked about the delay in census data collection and complaints heard about its impact on the quality and accuracy of the final census data. Commission staff referred the resident to the website of the Office of Financial Management, or OFM, which has a package tracking exactly those topics of data quality and accuracy of the 2020 census. A resident of Olympia criticized the limiting of testimony to 1 minute based on his own experience. He suggested that the commission either limit signups or require people to participate and later meetings if volume exceeds capacity. He also criticized the ongoing attacks against Senator Fain. Thank you for your comments, questions, and suggestions. We are doing our best to respond to your inquiries as we see them. I would now like to call roll. Commissioner Joe Fain.
Present.
Welcome. Commissioner April Sims.
Present.
Welcome. Commissioner Paul Graves.
Present.
Welcome. Commissioner Brady Walkinshaw.
Present. Thank you.
Welcome. During our discussion, I will call on you in an order as I typically do. And of course, I'll rotate for each discussion so that who speaks first will change and rotate. So our order this evening is Commissioner Fain, Commissioner Sims, Commissioner Graves, and Commissioner Walkinshaw to begin. Thank you. Let's move on to approve the meeting minutes for the meeting held on, on May 10th, 2021. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I didn't quite hear you, Commissioner Graves.
Aye.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so the motion passes. Thank you. I would now like to move on to our tribal consultation presentation. So commissioners and members of the public, the Washington State Redistricting Commission adopted a tribal consultation policy on April 19th. The intention of the forthcoming presentation is to provide an overview to the commission as we prepare to engage in tribal consultation. It is now my privilege to introduce Craig Bill, who is the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Commission and Commissioners, for the invitation to speak to you this evening and provide a little presentation and overview. As stated, my name is Craig Bill. I'm an enrolled member of the Swinomish Indian tribal community. I'm also a descendant of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Indian Reservation and the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So thank you. I know this is very important work that you all are undertaking. So again, I applaud you for stepping forward to do this, critical and important work that has tremendous amount of impact to communities and to all citizenry of the state of Washington. So my quick presentation here is just a real government-to-government overview, just a kind of a little baseline of understanding of demographic, kind of talk about the kind of foundations of government to government, and really kind of walk through what we do within the state of Washington, and the commitments and some of the laws that we have passed that hold our state agencies to that standard and commitment of government to government, and working with our sovereign tribal governments and in partnership and collaboration. So go ahead and kind of start with our first slide. So next slide, please. So again, just the first sort of overview is our demographics in the state of Washington. We are home to 29 federally recognized Indian tribes, as well as that are geographically located throughout the state. I have a couple of slides here more. I'll have a kind of a map and show you where the tribes are located. But as everyone knows, we have tribes through the northwest tip of the state of Washington. We have all across our great state, and larger land-based tribes and smaller tribal communities. And so we're kind of a good sort of cross-section, if you will. We also, within the state of Washington, recognize that there's 3 out-of-state tribes with treaty reserved rights in Washington. And I will touch on the treaty reserved rights sort of terminology later within the presentation. Next slide. Overall total population of American Indian Alaska Natives living within Washington is 198,000, and actually that number may be inaccurate just based upon census. Obviously, census drives the work that you all do, but I know that number is definitely sort of greater than what the 198,000 is, and I believe this is based off the 2010. It actually might be 2014 numbers. Approximately 70% of the American Indian and Alaskan Native population reside off reservation and primarily within our urban areas in our state, like in Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. And a lot of them are members from tribal citizens from out of state, whether it be from the southeast part of our country, for our Alaska, and all across our United States. So next slide. As kind of mentioned, here is a map. It's not to scale, but it is definitely kind of a good just capture of where our tribes are located within their, as mentioned, we have two large land-based tribes who are both 1 million acres plus, that being the Yakima Nation, as well as the Colville tribe. And other tribes kind of geographically located within rural communities, as well as we have tribes within an urban setting. Puyallup tribe and Muckleshoot tribe are within city areas. The Puyallup tribe is being right there within the city limits of Tacoma, as well as then spread out through the Port of Tacoma and city of Fife, as just kind of some examples of difference of locations and the like. Next map. Our next slide, please. So, or back one, please. So it's critical of understanding sort of tribal demographics and understanding is also understanding tribal history, and also understanding that where current reservations exist is only what is the current existing reservation, that the tribes did locate in throughout the state as a whole, and they had ceded areas and usual and accustomed areas that are part of the treaty, which I'll talk to later in this, but I wanted to give this sort of map that where you see, especially in the middle, if you take the Yakima Reservation, which is the gray reservation there, kind of within the tan sort of colors shaded area, you'll see the Yakima Nation Reservation as current, but then you look at the tan shaded area and the reservation extends almost to the North Canadian border, obviously goes down to the Columbia River and extends east, past the Tri-Cities and the like, so that is their ceded area and to where their bands resided and was from. So it's not just because the reservation is at where they're located doesn't mean they don't have interest and rights beyond that. And so that's a critical thing of understanding. And then you see that as well in some of the different shaded areas. But I think this map just kind of helps provide that sort of context. Next slide, please. One critical thing as we kind of go into government to government understanding is really getting a good comprehension or just a good baseline and respect of culture and cultural overview. Tribal communities are unique, independent, community sovereign communities with each a different culture and each a different understanding and respect of how they live and reside and what their belief system is. But to that point, I think this quote is always one that really just sticks out in my mind and is always there, that, this is from Chief Sealth. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. I think that's a very critical thing of understanding. Next slide, please. So baseline of cultural understanding is of creation, a creation belief. And that being the terminology, as you work within tribal communities and you work within, is the terminology you hear of since time immemorial, and the belief that their existence is since time immemorial. The songs, the customs, the traditions are passed down and their existence is since time immemorial. So that's the belief of time, or belief of where they're existing from. Another sort of base understanding is a differing sense of time, a differing sort of calendar, or how sort of the seasons come into play, and just the sort of different, whether it's the different moons kind of dictate the changes of the environment, change of our natural world. And so really it's just a differing sense of time of how do you value, and even that sort of plays into sort of modern sort of kind of function of the terminology, like we'll get to it when we get to it. We'll in all due time, and those are really sort of true things within a community. It's just a differing sense of that, the work needs to be done, and the work, you got to take care of the work first. Another sort of good, just sort of base cultural understanding is just giving versus acquiring. A lot of our tribal communities are rooted in, is what you give, not what you acquire. And so, and that's a real sort of core principle and when you're working with communities, when you're working with tribal people, of just having a sort of respect and understanding. And lastly, as kind of a base, is just a real holistic approach of how things are intertwined, how one thing affects the other, and that you could have a conversation in talking about education, but you also have to have a good understanding how that interrelates to health, how that interrelates to our natural resources, how it interacts with environment, how it interacts with all those different things. And so you could be there to talk about a specific topic, and then it could be a conversation about a few different other things, but then realizing that it all comes back, it all ties back together. And so it's just really looking at it from a global perspective and a more holistic understanding and approach. Next slide, please. And then really core, a cultural understanding is just the religious practices. Within our tribal communities is the traditional cultural ways that were handed down since time immemorial, that are sacred, to each respective tribe and to each respective person. And those, differ from Eastern Washington practice, within Longhouse, or what's different to the west side, within the smokehouse. And there's just different religious practices, and each are sort of unique, and some are similar, but those are sort of rooted as those traditional fundamental beliefs, and those do impact sort of thought process and the values of the life. There's also contemporary practices, within what you would see in any respective community, whether it's from our Catholic to other sort of Baptist or other evangelical sort of kind of Christian church-based churches. Another sort of religious practice again is use of sacred lands, is use of sacred areas and that could be for hunting, it could be for gathering, it could be for spiritual, it could be for praying, meditation, and those all sorts of have meanings, and those also have religious value. Again, that a lot of it tied to sense of area, sense of place, and sense of time. So again, next slide, please. So kind of, within that, I just want to again just provide that sort of just context of just base overview. What I think is another critical as we talk about government to government is really look at how tribes and how tribal rights come into play, and how tribal governments as sovereigns are acknowledged as sovereign governments. And that one is through the treaties and through the establishment of the federal recognition as a government. As you see, this is a good quote, as you're going to read. This is from Chief Justice John Marshall in 1832. Next slide, please. So, it's often asked, what is a treaty? And I think this Supreme Court citation really articulates it, to just a real core basis. A treaty including one between the United States and an Indian tribe, is essentially a contract between two sovereign nations. And so really, in that core essence is that it upholds and affirms that tribes are sovereign. They are a sovereign government existing, so that they're not a dependent upon underneath the jurisdiction of the state or county or local government. Next slide, please. Just kind of some treaty facts, are kind of statements of understanding. A treaty is not a grant of rights to an Indian tribe. It is a grant of rights from an Indian tribe to the US government, and a reservation of rights not granted. And so within that are reserved rights. The right to, within the treaty, each treaty is uniquely different. Some are very similar, but some have language around access to healthcare, access to education, ability to hunt and gather. And those are some of the foundational pieces, again, that still exist today, that sometimes find us within some court cases, find us within sort of jurisdictional disputes and the like, but those are living and breathing documents. And so they're organic, they're alive, and they're still existing today. Kind of another kind of base, treaty rights do not diminish with the passage of time, periods of non-use, or changes in technology. And some treaty rights extend outside of reservation boundaries, including the right to hunt, fish, and gather in usual and custom areas. So as I mentioned, we go back to the map of treaty ceded areas, or treaty, that tribes do have right of access when they granted those rights, and the US government held them in reserve for access in perpetuity. And so those, again, are standing rights. Next slide, please. So just as a kind of overview of the treaties that are existing here within Washington State, they are, the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which includes the Nisqually tribe, the Puyallup tribe, and the Squaxin Island tribe, and Treaty of Point Elliott, which is more north sound, including the Tulalip tribes, Suquamish tribe, Stillaguamish, Snoqualmie, Swinomish, Lummi, Upper Skagit, Nooksack. So there's a lot of tribes within that. And so you kind of go on, with kind of down the line there. And as you see, where they sort of, the timeline of these treaties of 1855. So in really sort of context, it's really not that long ago. We're really talking about our grandfathers' grandfathers, our grandmothers' grandmothers. And so as tribal people, these are just a couple of generations away in regards to the signing. And these treaties were signed pre-statehood. State didn't come into official statehood until 1889. So again, these predate statehood. Next slide, please. So of one of the premise of recognition was tribes signing a treaty, and that therefore kind of had that sort of standing in existence. When, as you see in those calendars, 1856, and then territorial governor sort of, and there were other tribes that still had yet to negotiate or didn't agree to the terms at that time. And so then territorial governor kind of went around, headed back east, if you will. And I think at that time, 1850, 1860s, kind of like the Civil War time. And so I don't believe he made it back out this way. But in the meanwhile, in 1800s, they changed how tribes are treaty making, or Congress did in 1871. Whereas presidents were given the power and authority to enter into treaty, Congress revoked that, and Congress then would have to, there are different pathway of entering into sort of treaties or the federal relations there. And so those two were, again, through executive order or through congressional acts. And so when you hear sort of some different terminologies that are used of a treaty tribe, or a tribe recognized via executive order, that's what the terminology is derived from. So there are some differences in where they are still unique in standing of being a federally recognized tribe and access to provision. There still is some difference in regards to off-reservation rights unless they are adjudicated or they get through other formal action, through congressional action to hunt or gather off-reservation, and some tribes that are successful in having done that. But again, it's just sort of a difference, whereas in the treaty, entering into the treaty, those are ceded time or ceded area reserved rights, but then within the sort of executive order, have to go through kind of a different process of establishing that. So there are, I believe, three tribes that were established via executive order, that being the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Spokane Tribe, and the Chehalis Tribe. Next slide, please. And so soon after that 1871 timeframe, again through time, the federal government, who does establish federal recognition, and just also too for process and knowledge, the state does not provide federal recognition. The state does not have any sort of process of recognizing. That is a federal process, and through the Department of Interior, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so, and that process is established under 25 CFR Part 83. Another pathway of recognition in current time is by act of Congress. You get legislation passed or a bill passed, and Congress can recognize that as well, or by decision of a U.S. federal court, are the current pathways of recognition. Next slide, please. So a lot of times, in the work of government to government, the question that gets asked is, what is tribal sovereignty? What does sovereignty mean? And so I think this is kind of a definition, I think, that sort of captures best captures that. And, is it a right? It is a right of tribes as domestic dependent nations to exercise self-determination and the right to self-government unless those powers have been modified by treaty or by an act of Congress. And so you take that as well as then what the Supreme Court states, and it sort of affirms and upholds that as tribes as sovereign in the terminology of tribal sovereignty. Next slide, please. And and just a real kind of quick sort of overview of tribal sovereignty of belief, and is that tribal sovereignty is inherent. Again, going back to the sort of the thought process of sovereignty isn't granted; it is an inherent foundation, kind of similar to the thought of since time immemorial. So it's not granted by any government, and it's recognized in treaty court decisions that constitute the U.S. Constitution. It's separate and independent from the federal and state governments, and subject to some limitations, as mentioned, whether that be via treaty or via act by Congress. Next slide, please. And here are just some, broad examples. As tribes are governments, are sovereign governments, and they have the power and the right to determine their form of government, define the conditions of their membership, or regulate domestic relations amongst members. And kind of see the list there. Create a tribal court, are just again some of the sovereign powers that tribes exert or hold in reserve if they want to utilize those rights. Yeah. Next slide, please. So kind of, again, just kind of, I know we can spend a lot more time on the kind of subject matters I discussed, and there's a lot actually more involved trainings and people who are creative just kind of give that. But I just want to give you a sort of just baseline understanding of what sort of prompts and begins our sort of interaction within the state of Washington as it relates to tribes, and how those really foundational pieces really have evolved over time. But it's really rooted in that, the state recognizes tribes as sovereigns, as sovereign governments. And it took a little time to get there, but that is really sort of that, again, that foundational. So next slide. So kind of before I kind of get into what the Centennial Accord is, I mean, in 1989 was really sort of that backdrop. When I mentioned of 1855, that really wasn't that long ago, as I mentioned. And so from that sort of time frame into the 1989, it is really that, a lot of different sort of policies that were established via federal law. Like one impacting thing that really brought sort of state tribal relations to more of an immediate focus was the passage of federal law, Public Law 280, which granted states jurisdiction over Indian reservations and Indian lands and Indian persons. And so that had an impactful thing where you kind of created a sort of cross-jurisdictional impact of the state on reservation lands. Then secondly, and that was in the 50s and the 60s, you kind of moved in sort of some of the fishing wars, fishing sort of battles that were existing in regards to the tribe's right to exercise their right to fish, their treaty-based rights, and to where then the court decisions, within U.S. v. Washington, which is the Bolt decision, or U.S. v. Oregon, which is rights on the Columbia River, which provided again that rights for tribes to exercise those reserved rights as part of those treaties. And so those really kind of were the backdrop of state tribal relations, was that sort of really sort of tense sort of engagement, was just sort of challenging at times, if you will, and and so within moving that time, the leadership within the 1980s really said, and with the state leadership at the time was saying, we keep ending up in court, we keep ending up in sort of legal disputes, we keep ending up in with just sort of differences of engagement. And so they, at that time in 1989, they committed to, how do we address things differently? How do we work together? How do we come together? And how do we meet on a regular basis to address our interests of mutual interest, mutual resolve? And so what came about of that sort of commitment and engagement was the 1989 Centennial Accord. So it was landmark at that time. I mean, no other state had taken that sort of proactive engagement, sort of moved or turned the page, if you will, in history. And the state served as sort of a leader. And, still to this day, it's not necessarily that it's perfect. It's just that, it's an evolving relationship, considering from where things were to where they exist sort of at that time. So what the Centennial Accord did was establish a government-to-government relationship where within the Centennial Accord document, it does recognize each respective sovereign, the state as a sovereign and a sovereign authority, and it recognizes tribal governments and their authority and their sovereign authority as a government. And so it just, again, follows along those previous slides that I had mentioned and some of the other sort of documents of, history of, treaty or executive policies, et cetera. And so one of the core things within the Accord was to establish mutual goals through an improved relationship and work together to address issues of mutual interest and mutual concern. And so with that has been a commitment. And so from 1989 till today, the governor, the governor's cabinet, and other elected officials have met annually with our 29 sovereign tribes. And so that has been an ongoing sort of dialogue and commitment to engage and just work together on issues of mutual interest. So next slide, please. So after kind of the accord was established in 1989, so a 10-year sort of look back, the tribes and the state leadership at that time, again, kind of convened, discussed, and wanted to have a further conversation of how do we further sort of evolve the relationship. You know, and again, it's just any sort of building relationship and any sort of thing where they just felt like we need to move beyond just sort of meeting. And so the thought at the time was we need to sort of institutionalize the government-to-government relationship. We need to kind of come, you know, have more sort of substance of how do we engage. And at that time too, in 1999, was really sort of some of the foundational pieces of developing consultation policies. The federal government was establishing its federal policy. The state was kind of evolving and beginning that sort of work as well. So there was just a real sort of interest to have sort of some global understanding, some global engagement as it relates to tribes and whether it's states, but a lot of it was sort of the federal, but you know, the state was really taking interest at that time to engage as well. So next slide, please. So under the Millennium Agreement was the following. What was the work? It was a commitment to work to increase understanding of tribes' legal and political status as governments through training opportunities. And so this derives of one of the missions of the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs, where we provide a training program on government-to-government and tribal relations to state employees and to outside entities and organizations and the like. Second, you know, develop a consultation process, protocols, and action plans, as well as identify agency tribal liaisons. So this is kind of the first sort of beginning of state agencies having an identified tribal liaison sort of to work, you know, as sort of a help someone sort of navigate the agencies as well as and work with tribes and have a sort of, you know, definitive point of entry. You know, the other big part was encourage the Washington State Legislature to establish a structure to address issues of mutual concern to the state and tribes. So after this sort of 1999, in the early sort of 2000 timeframe is when legislative bodies, both the Senate and the House, added tribal affairs to their committee structure. And so again, sort of that began that sort of evolved sort of engagement. And then kind of the other sort of lasting commitment was just enhancing communication coordination, you know, to strengthen the Office of Indian Affairs and member tribes' commitment to strengthen intertribal organizations. Again, just knowing that the work is kind of centered on certain areas and just, you know, how to strengthen and elevate those offices and organizations to help sort of communicate and coordinate. So again, you know, a lot of things sort of manifested from that time, and I think again the big thing being agency tribal liaisons and the commitment again for agencies to develop consultation policies and develop consultation plans. And so from that sort of point going forward, each agency, state agency, is, you know, has established a plan and has established a communications outreach plans or protocol. Next slide, please. And so another sort of major sort of piece in regards to state tribal relations was in 2004, Governor Locke at that time signed an out-of-state accord recognizing the Confederate Tribes of Umatilla, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs of their ceded lands within Washington. Again, you go back to that map and just the overlay of tribes having, you know, before state boundaries, before state lines, and recognition of their treaty rights, provided that recognition and signed an Allstate Accord with those tribes. Next slide, please. So taking that sort of as the backdrop and serving as a sort of guidance is that the Centennial Accord was a non-binding sort of document, if you will. It was a commitment. It was a commitment between, the executive branch, with the governor, and the commitment of tribal leaders to engage. And the Millennium Agreement was a likewise sort of non-binding document. And so within that time, the legislature, members of the legislature in 2012, and other tribal leaders, with the support of them, decided to memorialize the accord and elements of the Millennium Agreement into state law. And so that established RCW 43.376, which establishes the government-to-government relationship between tribes, between state government and federally recognized Indian tribes. And so under that, all state agencies, not just sort of executive branch, but all agencies are required to make reasonable efforts to collaborate in development of policies, agreements, and administrative policy that impacts Indian tribes. Also required to designate a tribal liaison who reports directly to the head of an agency. 3, ensure tribal liaisons and appropriate staff have training in government-to-government relations. 4, submit an annual report to the governor on tribal activities. And then lastly is the commitment or mandate for the governor and statewide elected officials and others to meet annually with the federally recognized Indian tribes. So where we moved again in 2012, and if you do a look back, 50, 60 years from where the state was to where they moved to, this is the mandate of law now, where all that sort of work and taking that sort of experience of history, then the state sort of moved into that different direction, and now they're held by law to do such. And then took the accord and the Millennium Agreement and really sort of have those be the sort of the framework of engagement. And really now we sort of have a baseline, with this RCW of how the tribes in the state sort of work together collaboratively, as well as even beyond this. And I know there's other sort of areas of interest to just continue to expand and evolve. Kind of, as I mentioned earlier, that the relationship is not necessarily of past tense. I mean, it really should be of current tense, and it really should be more organic, and it should be continue to evolve. How do we just always continue to look for improvement, the like. So next slide, please. So these next few slides are just kind of some experiences that I've had, and this is my 16th year of serving in this position. I've had the fortunate opportunity to be here and to work, with all tribes and with a number of different state agencies and elected officials and just general community as well, just to understand and see and kind of watch and as things sort of evolved. And what I've sort of picked up are just some base sort of looks and understandings of what are the principles of government to government. And I think it's really sort of simplified. And I get asked a lot, like, what is the secret, or how are we successful in what we do, or how do we engage? And I said, it's, while government to government is and working with tribes and some of the issues can be sort of legal based and kind of have some sort of real, formal sort of issue and engagement, the principles kind of really get down to some core just relationship pieces of respect, trust, and communication. And those are some of the core things of working with tribes and working to one of successful is that each sovereign respects, each can trust, and then the second, third being, of communicating. And I think so, over time, where the state was in history, of, again, having that sort of acrimonious sort of engagement with tribal communities and tribal people, in the 1950s, 1960s, and just the sort of mistrust over historical time, to move into sort of some of the principles now. It's taken a little while to build that trust, to build sort of respect that, coming with good intention, and secondly, just really, and communicating. And so I think that those bridges have been built, and the foundations have been laid by great people, and who's worked within the sort of arena in the past. And again, it's kind of just serve as that sort of principles there. Next slide. And so these are some of the best practices of sort of engaging and implementing. One is sort of the internal sort of look as an agency, working for a state or kind of internal government, is really just develop a strategy and action plan, to change agency culture. How do you understand? How do you engage? How are you, kind of working with tribes, not working, or working in collaboration and working in partnership, and working together as a sovereign, not necessarily as a any sort of overseeing or sort of sort of management of, but really sort of more in partnership with. Second really is institutionalizing sort of that accessibility and openness, and those are again rooted in that sort of trust and that communication and that respect of how do you sort of foster that sort of openness to have questions answered, or just understanding and just education about what you sort of do. Third, is really evaluate policy positions versus litigation positions. And that's really one of the core elements of the accord, was really saying, how do we sort of maybe look at things differently, and that there's multiple pathways to get to the result, and that maybe sometimes we just sometimes within our structures, we only look at it from a sort of a narrow point of view. We don't look at it in a sort of a broader sense, and maybe there's different ways that we can accomplish that. And and I think that's just always a continual sort of thing of how do we, how do we work on that? How do we get there? Sort of externally, I believe is one is communicate proactively, and really share information. Again, back to that sort of, three principles there of really having a proactive, respect, trust, and communication about what the work's going on, what the work's doing. Again, the second bullet really kind of plays with that third bullet up top internally of be open-minded about solutions and take reasonable risks. Again, there's different ways to look at things, and it may, and I think this is also too of that one size doesn't fit all for all tribes. I think what, again, this is just perspective. I'm not necessarily speaking on behalf of any sort of tribal community. It's really sort of given sort of a broad context, and that tribes are uniquely different. And so what works for a tribe and, within a smaller community on the west side of the mountains doesn't necessarily work for the same in Eastern Washington. And so we can't just use a broad brush to paint, all the same. We definitely need to take actions uniquely and individually of interest, and maybe just have some sort of, again, sort of base principles, but really have, flexible enough to kind of, address each tribe's unique individual needs. Yeah, and it kind of plays my third bullet there, understanding and respect, all tribes are different. And I think that that's just, again, that goes with the communication, that goes with any sort of the proactive work that exists there. And most importantly, it's just build relationships. And that I always recommend, as an agency, your first contact shouldn't be when something is needed. It should be definitely, there should be some sort of introduction. There should be some sort of at least understanding. So your first engagement necessarily shouldn't be an ask. It should be at least, hey, this is FYI, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is and that, hey, down the road, we may be asking for information. It just, in any situation, it helps sort of provide that sort of door opener, and that your first engagement isn't sort of in that sort of more intensified sort of conversation or construct. So that's just I think next slide. I think that's the end, I believe. I think that's the end. I'll hope that was hope I didn't go too fast or talk too fast or but definitely take any questions or comments or.
Thanks very much. We appreciate your time and your generosity of time, spending this time with us. So I'm now going to ask the commissioners if they have comments and questions for you. Commissioner Fain, to begin with you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I was the first law school graduate who had to take tribal law as one of the provisions of the bar exam, and I wish that I had just sat through your presentation prior to taking that part of the exam. But that was, of course, years ago. Now this has been a very very insightful presentation, and also I'm pleased that the Redistricting Commission, under the leadership of the chair, has taken a very proactive interest with its building tribal relationships and doing just as you suggested, not necessarily waiting for something that needs to be done, but taking those first steps to reach out and engage at the front end. So again, just appreciate you being here and appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fain. Commissioner Sims, do you have comments or questions?
I think, yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It is really helpful in thinking about our engagement and communication and the trust that we want to build with our tribal communities. I'm wondering, Craig, I don't know if you have been tracking the conversations that we've been having regarding outreach and our plan to host outreach forums in all of the congressional districts. But I'm just curious if you have any recommendations for us, specifically as we're thinking about our outreach, how we might do that with the 29 tribes.
Yeah, I would definitely, as you develop that and if you create those opportunities, I think it would definitely be, welcomed with open arms. And I know a lot of tribes have, high interest in the work that you are doing, as it has impacted other communities in the past. And so I know that if those opportunities are allowed, I think you should, or of interest to the commission, I think you should definitely do that. So it might take a little sort of organizing, but it'll be well worth the effort. Again, as each community is distinctly different, and some may decline, as they might just participate in other venues or other opportunities. But I think if you offer it, and I know a lot of tribes will take you up on it, individually, I guess, to have that sort of engagement with them. So I strongly recommend.
Thank you, Commissioner Sims. Is there more you'd like to add?
Not at this time, but thank you. I think it's something for us to consider as part of our ongoing outreach. I know that we have some meetings, some Monday night meetings, I believe, scheduled for that, but just wondering if that is enough space and opportunity for us to really deeply engage with our tribal communities and the tribal nations. So I appreciate your presentation, Craig. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Graves, do you have comments or questions?
Thank you, Craig. Thanks so much for that presentation and your time. We really appreciate it. I don't have anything specific right now, but I do, while I can't speak for the other commissioners, I get the sense from even the things we've talked about so far that you have a commission here that really cares about this and wants to engage with you. And so I hope that you'll take this and probably our next couple of meetings as that kind of let's get to know each other before we have any particular asks. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Commissioner Graves. Commissioner Walkinshaw, comments or questions?
Thank you, Craig. I really enjoyed the presentation and echo what my colleagues have said, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. So, Craig, thank you for being here with us and for taking the time. And I also want to acknowledge that Craig has provided us quite a lot of advice as we move forward and prepare and educate ourselves in preparation for consultation. So thank you very much for being a partner to us as we move forward. And it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, commission members. Enjoyed it, and please feel free to contact if you have any follow up or anything. Please just reach out and whatever I can do to assist and help facilitate the conversation. Again, I think it's good to learn, to educate, and understand. And so I think that you guys are on a sort of good pathway as you begin that sort of entry into working with tribal communities and elevating that conversation to that sort of commission table, which is a sort of, I just think it is a great thing. And, I know good things will sort of happen, from those conversations and dialogue. So again, thank you, and look forward to talking with you further.
Terrific. Have a great evening. You're welcome to join us, of course. We're happy you're here, and we'll move on to the next part of the agenda now. Thank you. So let's move on to the executive director update. And so I want to invite our executive director, Lisa McLean, to provide some updates to us. Lisa.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. It's hard to follow such a good presentation, but I'll try. I have several different areas, and I'm going to stop at appropriate time to ask if there's any comments. First, sort of an admin update in a sense. I'd like to correct what I said last week regarding the delivery of laptops. It's been kind of confusing what was ordered before my arrival and what was ordered afterwards, but I think I managed to get a handle on it this week. There were 10 regular laptops ordered, and there were 4 engineering laptops, which are some sort of super duper, have to be made up to specifications. And what I was saying last week that was not going to be delivered or shipped until the end of July were the engineering laptops. This last week's 10, even it was the next day after we had our meeting, the 10 laptops were delivered, and they're being prepared for you all, and they will be sent to you. And obviously not 10, but one of the 10 will be sent. I believe that Commissioner Fain may have gotten his already. And I know that Commissioner Augenstein, I think yours is very close to being sent. So they're just, as they prepare them, they're sending them off. So so you should receive those shortly. And then the good news is even this week, we got it changed that actually the ones that were supposed to be shipped at the end of July are actually apparently arriving by mid-June or even earlier. So that's, to correct myself, there's good news. Okay. Maybe to keep in the admin thing before we go into a round of questions about that, I would maybe give you an update on the budget as well. The month closes on the 15th of every month. And so May 15th, the month of April closed, and I have a budget update for where we are right now. The commission has spent $98,000. Of that, we spent in the last month $55,000, which includes about $30,000 in salaries, $31,000 in salaries, about $20,000 in goods and services, and then $5,000 in equipment. So we're still continuing our modest spending. That concludes my administrative portion. Any questions? You're muted.
Commissioner Sims? Questions, comments?
I don't have any questions. Thank you, Lisa.
Commissioner Graves?
No questions. Thanks.
Commissioner Walkinshaw?
Nothing to add. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Commissioner Fain?
No questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Lisa?
Okay, so moving on to a second portion, which is basically some of the stuff that we talked about last week in terms of the public outreach. First off, I had really hoped to come to this meeting to be able to tell you that our website is live, but that's not true. I have instead come to you and say that our website should be live on Thursday. We ended up having a couple of glitches with regard to, not glitches, but some difficulties with regard to the encryption server and who's hosting the website, and also some issues with making sure that we do some testing of the ADA compliance stuff. So we just want to really, instead of launching a half product, we want to launch a full product, it's still going to be a work in progress, but we hope to launch that on Thursday. So that's the main thing with that. We've also, I asked, and I'm sorry, I didn't check before this meeting. I asked that on our old website, the one that we have right now, there should be something on there that says new website coming soon. So that people, because I think I keep getting kind of questions about that. So I'm trying to maybe tell people that, but hopefully we can put all this to bed by Thursday.
Yeah.
So that, and then in keeping in that same sort of outreach vein, and then I can ask for questions on public outreach. If any of you are signed up for our Gov Delivery, you will have seen that we sent out a media advisories, and we invited the press to our events, a news advisory and a media advisory. We sent out 1,568 emails. And we can report as of the beginning of this meeting that 993 people had opened our emails. We cannot give you a number as to how many people want to participate in our meetings on Saturday, but that did go out. And I was just very happy at how, wow, we had such a great, robust list building on what you all had offered us last week. I think we really improved upon it. And it's, now tomorrow we'll send out the invitation for Congressional District 6, which is next Monday. So that's that portion of it, in case anybody has any comments or questions.
Okay, Commissioner Graves.
He's muted.
That's okay. Commissioner Walkinshaw, we'll come back to him.
Thank you so much. Nothing to add.
Commissioner Fain.
Nothing to add, thanks.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Sims.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. I'm excited that we finally have a schedule and can finally start advertising our public meetings. I just wonder, not to add to the plate of the folks that are doing all this hard work, but if it's possible, or if there's been any conversation about creating some sort of graphic that can be shared on social media that includes all of the calendar of events.
Yes, there is discussion of that. We just reactivated the Facebook and the Twitter page. And I did not check in today. The announcement should have been also sent via Twitter and Facebook also. So that was today being done. But I see what you're saying is sort of the whole list. And we have definitely discussed that, but I will double check tomorrow and make sure that we get something out. Because I do think that it's important, unfortunately, for those who are having the meeting, for those who we're meeting with in Congressional District 5 and 7, that they have been given little time, but if we could let people know about who are in Congressional Districts 9, 10, 8, 3, now when they can sign up, I agree with you. I've been trying to see if we can't advertise them even on our own website.
Yeah, maybe just a graphic that folks can share around might be helpful. I would be happy to promote it myself. So if folks are able to come up with that, thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Sims. And I will just reiterate to the public that we're excited for these first meetings, but they will not be the last. These are just the preliminary meetings. Okay, so one more opportunity, Commissioner Graves, comments or questions? All right, let's move on to Lisa, your next topic.
Yeah. The last part is our GIS and our mapping and all that is a two-part part is based. I wanted to let you know that we have advertised today a position for GIS analyst and coordinator. I sent you I didn't send you a link to it, but I sent you a copy of that. So that job's been advertised. We're really hoping that we're giving it 2 weeks to get some good resumes in. Through all of the research that Tom and I have done, through the contacts we've made some very good contacts with people who have good contacts with the type of person we're looking for. So we really expect that it's going to be well promoted. And we're hoping that we can be doing interviews at the beginning of June. And then the last thing, maybe I'll turn it over to Tom Jensen to talk about our mapping tool and our recommendation with regard to mapping. Tom, you want to take over? You're muted.
Good evening, commissioners. At the last meeting, we reviewed two viable options for the citizens redistricting tool. We talked about Esri redistricting and CityGate's web-based citizen redistricting. We're recommending CityGate web tool for several different reasons. First of all, the commission is already using CityGate's desktop tool. Having a single vendor solution will allow for seamless sharing of information between the citizens web tool and the commission's desktop tool. CityGate also will help us load the data. They will load the 2020 census data when it becomes available in mid-August. And they will help us make adjustments for our group quarter data. They also have agreed to load additional data sets if we need them. They will provide a hotline for citizens online. There will also be tutorials for such things like, how do I create a comment? How do I create a community of interest? And what we're looking for there is a short 1 or 2 minute tutorial that supports citizen input. They're also working on a new feature which will allow free software like Dave's redistricting to actually submit comments and plans through those products into the web tool, which will then make it available to commissioners as well. There is also a difference in the costs. The CityGate, let me mention one more thing that is pretty important too. CityGate is providing technical support, but the technical support not only covers the web tools, but it also covers the desktop tools. So it's a complete technical support of all the software that we're using. And then finally, there was a difference in the costs. CityGate's solution, which included all the items we just discussed here, is around $74,000. And Esri's costs range from about $230,000 up to $270,000. So thank you for this opportunity to share with you what we've been working on this last week.
Thank you, Tom. So as you know, this is a topic that is an action item in our agenda this evening. So I do want to make sure that each of you have an opportunity to ask questions at this point. So beginning with Commissioner Walkinshaw, questions, comments?
Thank you for the work. No questions at this time.
Thank you. Commissioner Fain.
Thanks, Tom. I've been, digging through the little document that you sent over in terms of the recommendations. I did have a couple of questions, but of course I want to make sure that I've got the document up in front of me while I ask them. First thing I'll say is that I did go to a couple of the jurisdictions, one in Canada, I think Virginia might have been the other one, that have a public-facing CityGate tool. And I found it, maybe a little bit of training necessary, but I found it pretty user-friendly. The two questions that I have, one probably a little bit more in the weeds, which is, have we decided how we're what data fields we make available to the public to for when they're going in and making their own maps? Is there just sort of a custom set of things that are always included, or is that a decision point that comes to commission or commission staff?
We will, initially, we're going to provide the 2010 geographies with the 2010 census. Those two line up and work well together.
That's the package of information, but in terms of the individual like cell types, is it what kind of demographic data and everything like that that's included in those?
What we'll do is we'll get a list of the information that's available, and then we can decide what we want to include. We're able to customize this interface based around our specific state needs. And so that might be an area that we need to do some research on.
Okay, just wanted to know what the process was for making that decision. The second question I had to do with the cost for hosting. During the presentation last week, the LegTech, could host it for $100 a month, or Citigroup could host it for $2,000. I assume you are opting for them to host it for some performance issues. I just figured I'd ask what those were.
Yes, and the 2,000 was on the high side. It could actually be less than that, depending on the amount of work and the requirements that we specify that we need here within the state. We're thinking a hosted service by a single company is going to streamline the process. If we have any issues, we have such a short time frame here. It just if we have a problem, we go one place and hopefully it will be solved, because they will be managing the databases, they'll be backing up the databases, and they'll providing the software support.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Commissioner Sims.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the memo. So I just had a couple of questions. I think my first one was just around the total cost. It looks like the total cost for Citygate is assuming a 12-month contract for the cloud service.
Yes.
Are we anticipating that we will need a full 12 months?
We might not. I think we're anticipating we'll need it through next April. So it could be less than that.
Okay. And are we anticipating through next April just to get us through legislative session? And the
Yes.
entire process, and anticipating that the public will still be accessing and using this tool to provide feedback to the commission, or just that there will be data on the server that we'll want to continue to access or have access to?
I think there'll be data on the server. There might be some technical adjustments that need to be made along the way. Even after you finish your work in November, there might be some kind of cleanup things that we will need to be able to do.
And would we be locked into a contract for the full 12 months, or is that a decision that we can make as we get closer?
I don't think that's been decided yet. We have not signed any contracts at this point. We're looking for direction initially, but then we can iron out some of those details.
Sure. I might not have asked the question very well either. I mean, are we anticipating that we would sign a 12-month contract, or are we thinking that we'll do this on a month-to-month basis depending on the needs of the commission?
Can I interject here? It's a month-to-month. It can be month-to-month.
Okay.
It's kind of quoted that way. I'm actually going to try to see if we can't pay for what we are for sure going to have now. But I agree with you, is that we foresee that it might not be through April, it might be through March. Maybe we go month to month after we definitely go through to maybe the end of the year, maybe January, and pay for that up front.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would not want to delay the vote over, a $2,000 a month. I think the proposal for Citygate is money well spent if it encourages, it makes it easier for the public to engage in the process. I was just curious about the $2,000 a month. Just stood out to me in terms of time frame. But I think that's all I have. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Sims. Commissioner Graves.
Thanks very much.
Comments?
I don't have it. Yeah, I don't have additional questions right now.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thanks to Tom Jensen and Lisa McLean for all the work that you've done to prepare this, the memo and the cost comparison, and thanks to the commissioners for your questions and comments. Let's now move on to the public comment portion of our agenda. So members of the public, you're always welcome to sign up for the public comment period. We cut off registration by noon on the day of a commission business meeting and 24 hours prior to each regional meeting. So we have 7 participants who have registered to make public comment this evening, and each speaker will be provided 2 minutes. Tonight, our web tech, Sean Murray, will facilitate public testimony so that I can attend to what you're saying. Sean will call your name, at which time your status in Zoom will change from observer to panelist. When Sean calls your name, you will have 2 minutes to speak, and a countdown clock will appear on your screen. At the end of your allotted time, you will be muted. So we realize that 2 minutes is a very brief time in which to share your comments. We are interested in what you have to say and urge you to send your written comments to us via the following email address, and that's comment@redistricting.wa.gov. Sean?
Yes, good evening, Chair. We had 7 individuals sign up for tonight's meeting. We have 4 individuals who are actually in the meeting. So our first panel will be Brian Hess, as he's just shown up, as well as Jeffrey Olson. Brian, if you want to unmute and begin your testimony, you can start whenever.
Thank you once again for the meeting and having it as open and transparent as always. I appreciate that you guys are working on trying to get the mapping tools and all put together. The webpage, I also appreciate hearing why it was not live. It does help and makes sense with that. And also I want to say thank you for updating the Facebook page. That has been very helpful. It's allowed me to reach out to others to let them know when your meetings are occurring. Something that I would like to ask if you guys can consider when you're listening to people talk is, and it's from experience here, Lake Lawrence happens to be in one district. I forget the district number that it's in. It's by Yelm, and it's not in the 10th congressional district, and yet it shares a lot of resources and things that are similar to the 10th congressional district. If we can look at trying to make sure that we keep communities like that together, it would be very helpful. And I understand it may mess up the population rule, but just please be considerate of something like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hess. I want to ask the commissioners at this time if you have any questions for Mr. Hess. All right, thank you very much for being willing to testify.
Thank you.
And next we have Jeffrey Olson, if you want to begin your testimony. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. First comment on the Indian presentation. I like the quotation from John Marshall, but history tells us that Andrew Jackson wouldn't obey, and that led to the Trails of Tears for the Cherokees. It also fouled up some other non-Indian groups, but that's one point. The second point I would like to say is school board and fire districts also going to be included on the, now I'll get to the meat in my discussion. Congressional districts facing the 5th. Only the 4th surrounds the 5th. No other congressional district touches the 5th. There are 3 congressional districts that borders the 4th. They are the 3rd, the 8th, and the 1st. Only the 8th has counties inside Eastern Washington. And any attempt to help the Democrats in Spokane County, they're going to have to get the help from either the 1st or the 8th district. Now, I shouldn't tell you how to do it, but one item is in the 8th to move Pierce County into the 3rd, which will force the 4th all the way to the Cascade, and then have the 8th move up into the touching the 5th. You can't change it. That's it. Any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Olson, for your time and coming to be with us tonight. And so we will attend to your question about whether school boards will be included. I appreciate that, and I'll make sure that our staff respond to you appropriately. And we appreciate your advice about the way that we could conduct redistricting. Thank you. Sean?
Excellent. Thank you so much for your testimony. And we have our next panel. First, we have Robin McGee and Jerry Herbert after. Robin, you're welcome to start whenever you are.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to address the redistricting commission this evening. The work performed by this group is extremely important. It impacts everyone in our state. This group needs to be able to work together with minimal conflicts, as well as with others outside the group who are providing input, which could prove invaluable. Transparency is therefore imperative to the successful completion of the work by this commission. In full transparency, I'm a survivor of sexual assault. I blame myself for that situation for years, convincing myself that I had chosen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I said no repeatedly at that time to no avail. Senator Joe Fain allegedly raped Candace Faber in 2007. She said no also to no avail. She was finally able to gather enough bravery to come forward with that information in 2016. An investigation of this rape was launched, but was later blocked by Joe and his colleagues after he lost his seat in the election of 2018. Joe's presence on this commission sends a very clear and transparent message to the survivors of sexual assault like myself, that our allegations of sexual assault do not matter and will not be taken seriously. I'm here tonight to ask Joe to please resign from this commission. We need to support survivors of sexual assault and ensure they're not intimidated from joining these meetings by having to relive their experiences like I have tonight when speaking directly to a sexual assault perpetrator. Thank you for your consideration and support for victims of violence.
Thank you for choosing to join us this evening.
Next
Sean?
we have, next we have Jerry Herbert, if you don't mind turning on your video and beginning your testimony. Jerry Herbert. We're not getting any responses. Oh, here we go.
Alrighty. Jenny, what was the
Jerry,
date
you can
of
begin
the thing
your
at
testimony.
Island Hut real quick?
Wednesday, May 26th, 11:30. It's a casual gas.
Jerry, are you able to be in an area where we're able to hear you clearly? Jerry, are you able to unmute? And he's gone. Chair, I believe that's going to be it.
Great, thank you. And so that sometimes happens because sometimes when a person's status changes, they're not quite sure and they feel that they got kicked off. So we'll just continue to advise the public that that is a little disconcerting when your status changes. And we look forward to seeing you next time, perhaps. So that ends our public comment period. Let's move on to our next agenda item, which is action. So it is our intention to take action on the mapping tool. So the mapping tool analysis was shared with you in your packet of materials, commissioners, as outlined by Tom Jensen and our executive director, Lisa McLean, this evening. Before we move on, are there additional questions or comments? Commissioner Walkinshaw.
No, thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Fain.
None at this time.
Commissioner Sims.
None for me. Is it appropriate now to make a motion?
You bet.
All right, then I move that we purchase a license for City Gates, my districting software, based on the recommendation from Lisa McLean and Tom Jensen.
I'd second.
Terrific. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? I'm not sure. I caught a little echo there, so I'm not sure if I got anybody. So I don't see anyone opposed. All right, terrific. So the motion passes. Thank you, commissioners. And so at this time, I would like to adjourn our meeting. Thank you, commissioners, for your service, for your time, and for your attention this evening. I recognize that it takes time and effort for you to be fully present, and it's quite a commitment to be prepared for these meetings. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of the residents of Washington for your commitment and leadership. I would also like to thank members of the public who have taken the time to join us this evening. Thank you to the staff who've helped to prepare the commission for this meeting. Lisa McLean, Jamie Nixon, Paul Campos, Osta Davis, Anton Gross, and Ali O'Neill provided staff support for discussion and action items. Tom Jensen provided consultation for the mapping tool and GIS staffing. Sean Murray provided tech support. Maria Garza provided admin support, including taking minutes. Thank you to Lisa and Becky from Legislative Support Services for continued support. This meeting is now adjourned. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.